So, Chapter 244 of JJK is officially out, and people have mixed feelings about it. See, I genuinely believe that the JJK fandom is split into two different kinds of people. There are those who love and appreciate a good Gegekatami yappening, and those who absolutely despise it. I fortunately fall under the categorization of the former. About 95% of the time, whenever this absolutely insane mangaka decides to go on a chapter-long yapping fest, I usually really enjoy it. Not because I want to be like, oh, I'm different from everybody else, I like when they use big words, but because about 95% of my life doesn't require any mental input whatsoever. And therefore, when I'm poring over poorly translated leaks of a college-level Japanese law class, it's the 5% of my life where I actually have to think. And so, while whenever Gegekatami starts yapping, a lot of people's eyes roll into the back of their head and they just start flipping through the pages as fast as they can, I try to treat those chapters like a brain exercise and give my brain the 20 minutes of thinking that it deserves every 2.5 weeks. And while there has been a lot of chapters I have had to reread multiple times of JJK just to get a cursory understanding of what was going on, this chapter's gotta be top 5.
But Nick, if chapter 244 is a straight yappening chapter, why are we talking about it today?
I mean, there's been tons of yappening chapters that we haven't covered on this page, and you've openly admitted the fact that you don't want this page to be singularly focused on JJK. And considering the fact that you only post 2 videos a week on this channel, you can't just commit half of your videos to JJK manga reviews. And you're right. Me, I can't do that for non-important chapters, but this is an important chapter. If you can parse through the roughly translated Japanese legal talk, which many weren't able to do, which is where I come in, because it's my job to bash my head against the most complicated topics in anime and manga until I understand them so I can explain them to you. And outside of breaking down roughly translated Japanese legalese, there's also a massive reveal in this chapter about what Yuji's curse technique is. Yeah, buried all that legal conversation about the statutes of limitations and if they still apply to murders committed in the Heian period, there is a moment when Yuji most definitely reveals his curse technique. And my god, I don't know how I didn't realize it sooner. Also, I don't know how nobody else has realized it. It's so obvious. Like, just so infuriatingly obvious. Right there. It was right there in front of me. You predict everything that's going to happen in Boruto Chapter 4, but you can't see the absolute softball that Gegekatami's been pitching to you for a 1.5 years. So yeah, if this entire chapter was just about Kusakabe, Itadori, and Higurama talking about whether or not we could persecute Sukuna for murders he committed in the Heian era, boy oh boy, would I not be talking about it. I'd wait until the fight between Higuruma, Itadori, and Sukuna wrapped up, and then I would do a massive recap video on everything that happened and explain what went down and why. But I have to make today's video out of sheer anger for myself. So with no further ado, let's get into Chapter 244 of JJK. But before we get into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to hear me do breakdowns on all things anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Talk is Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime. This week, it's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Or if you want to look like somebody who keeps up with all things anime and manga, go ahead and meander on over into my anime merch store, takusanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. All right, hope you brought your pen and your paper, and possibly a graduation cap and gown, because after today's episode, you might be able to graduate from Japanese law school. Genuinely, at a certain point, you gotta start wondering, how does Gegekatami even know all this? You gotta assume this man's just doing research before every chapter he writes, which I guess is somewhat relatable, because here I am with 14 tabs open about Japanese law to try and explain it to you. But the problem with all of this is that he had to think of it. I just have to pick up the pieces. So, as we all know, if you read Chapter 243, you'll know that the chapter ended with Yuta decapitating Kenjaku, and Kenjaku telling Yuta that somebody will inherit my will. Well, apparently, at least temporarily, that timeline is done and dusted. We're done with Kenjaku, Yuta is hurrying back to try and get back to all the other sorcerers, and we open up 244 with Higuruma, Yuji, and Sukuna, pretty much in the exact same positions that they were about 6 or so chapters earlier. And that is with Yuji and Higurama descending down from the building that they were standing on top of towards Sukuna, who's in his true form. But don't worry, we don't stick with them long. It's time for class. And apparently, legendary coward Kusakabe is our teacher. But also, apparently, legendary coward Kusakabe is fantastic at planning, as he appears to pretty much be in charge of the anti-Sukuna Kenjaku coalition. And the first thing that we see Kusakabe and the coalition talking about is the plan to dispatch Kenjaku, which is exactly what happened. Takaba is to go up to Kenjaku and distract him with his technique long enough that Yuta can sneak away and decapitate him. And you gotta give credit where credit is due. Boy oh boy, did Kusakabe make a plan that could work. Now the caveat to this plan is that this plan is only meant to be done if Gojo loses. Because the plan if Gojo won was just have Gojo kill Kenjaku. But Gojo did lose, so now we're here. Kusakabe then keys us into something that we don't know, and that's that after Yuta dispatches of Kenjaku, he's to rush back to the coalition and help with all the other ongoing battles. So I guess currently we can imagine that Yuta is running back with Kenjaku's head about as fast as he can. Now, if hypothetically Yuta decides to leave Kenjaku's head behind, then we definitely have some issues. Because Takaba might be dead. He shouldn't be, but he might have killed himself with his curse technique because he finally achieved everything he ever wanted to. And if Takaba is dead, there's a possibility that Kenjaku can just pop on out of Geto's head and do a little brain transfer into Takaba's head and then get Toon Force, which would be bad for everyone. After devising the plan of Yuta running back to the coalition after decapitating Kenjaku, Kusakabe switches the topic of conversation over to Sukuna, saying that they need to figure out if Gojo loses, who's gonna jump in to battle against Sukuna. To which Kasumo retorts and goes, oh, are these guys idiots? It's all out battle. Everybody should jump in. And while that isn't like the worst idea, assuming everybody is somewhere near as powerful as Kashimo, they're not, which Kusakabe brings up, because certain members of the coalition would do next to nothing in a battle against Sukuna. Kusakabe, unfortunately, uses Miwa, who's standing right next to him, as Miwa can no longer use a katana. Because Miwa in the Shibuya incident basically made a Gon promise. That is to say that Miwa, in order to land a strike against Kenjaku that would actually possibly kill him, made a binding vow to use all of the power she would ever have in exchange for never ever picking up a katana again. And therefore, Miwa, while she is around, is relatively useless. Still got that simple domain though, so don't try putting her in a domain expansion, because it won't work for like 4 seconds. But I live my life as a testament to what I can accomplish in 4 seconds. I don't know why I said that. But after Kusakabe is done pointing out just how useless Miwa is, Noritoshi Kamo, the new Noritoshi Kamo, not the old 9 pregnancies, 9 abortions, 9 death wound paintings Noritoshi Kamo that was actually just Kenjaku, Noritoshi Kamo, stands up and goes, yeah, I'm probably gonna die in a battle against Sukuna too, so I think I'm just gonna leave with my family and protect them somewhere that's not Japan. Which, you know, like, incredibly fair. Like, oh, I'm sorry, Kenjaku wants to merge just Japan with Tengen? Yeah, I'll just go to China for the weekend. Like, why would I be here? However, something really interesting happens after Kamo stands up and tells everybody that he's gonna leave. One, Kusakabe is like, yeah, that's fine. This isn't a public execution. You can go and do whatever you want. But 2, Yuji says, don't beat yourself up. You've actually been a massive help as a teacher. Specifically in the leaks that I read, Yuji says, you've been a big help teaching me various things. Yuji then follows this up by saying something even more interesting, that Choso is a bad teacher. Now, this is 1.5 panels buried early on into a chapter almost entirely dedicated to Japanese law. However, in those 2 lines, Yuji has revealed something possibly incredibly interesting to us. Think about the one thing that Noritoshi Kamo and Choso have in common. Well, 1, technically, they're both Kamos, as the old Noritoshi Kamo was the person who knocked up the woman who made the first death wound painting accidentally 9 separate times and then forced her to have 9 abortions to create the 9 actual death wound paintings, which means that all of the 9 death wound paintings, only 3 of which were ever actually given form, are all technically Kamos. Wait, there's still 6 other death wound paintings, all of which were confirmed by Choso when he allied himself with Yuji to still be in the Jujutsu High warehouse in Tokyo that Mahito stole the first 3 from. However, Choso was able to follow the spiritual energy of these 6 unformed death wound paintings so they could get to the Star Room to defend Tengen. But Kenjaku also ends up in the Tomb of the Stars, which gave Kenjaku not only access to Tengen in the Tomb of the Stars, but also possibly the location of the 6 other death wound paintings. And he said somebody is going to inherit his will, but you know who has already inherited his will? His 6 illegitimate children. Kenjaku used Maximum Uzumaki after absorbing Mahito, and Mahito is a special grade curse, which means that he's able to use Idol Transfiguration as a one-time use technique. And he hasn't used it yet. Oh my god. I think I cracked it. Unless he did use Idol Transfiguration already, in which case, I don't know, the theory's a little bit shakier, but there's definitely ways to work around that. That could be a video. Anyways, you know what all of the death wound paintings have in common? The fact that they've all inherited the Kamo's curse technique, blood manipulation. Now, all 3 of the death wound paintings use blood manipulation differently. And this is because every single one of the death wound paintings is meant to represent one of the 9 phases of a body decomposing, with Choso, Eso, and Kechisu symbolizing the first 3 stages: swelling, Eso, and bloody phase. And therefore, the way that they use their blood manipulation ability is heavily dependent on the stage of decomposition that they're based off of. But if there's one thing that both both Noritoshi Kamo and Choso could be teaching Yuji, what would it be? There's one similarity between them. We were just talking about it. It's blood manipulation. What else would Noritoshi Kamo be good at teaching and Choso be bad at teaching? And therefore, this makes it fairly obvious, at least to me, that both Noritoshi Kamo and Choso are trying to teach Yuji how to use blood manipulation. Real questions that arise from this are why and how. As many people's gut reaction to this kind of information dump would be that Yuji is not a Kamo, but he kind of is. So yes, Yuji is Yuji Itadori, the combination of Kaori Itadori and Jin Itadori getting it on. However, in actuality, that was Jin Itadori and Kenjaku getting it on to make Yuji. Therefore, as we all know, Kenjaku is Yuji's mother. And what do we know about Kenjaku, specifically his curse technique? It's that Kenjaku has the ability to switch from body to body, and every single time he switches to a new body, he gets all of their cursed energy, their memories, their cursed technique, everything. And that memory, cursed energy, and cursed technique comes with him as he switches between bodies. This is why, as Geto, he still has Kaori's anti-gravity technique, which means as Kaori, he still had blood manipulation. And therefore, as he was holding on to the cursed technique and cursed energy and memories of Noritoshi Kamo, a man who he spent a large amount of his life as, there is a better than fair chance that Yuji also possibly got the cursed energy or the cursed technique of the Kamo clan. My God, it's been in front of our eyes for a while now. But we all got so caught up in the jokes of Kenjaku gasping when it came out and putting it back in that we forgot to realize that Kenjaku holds on to the cursed technique and cursed energy of everybody he's ever been, and he has a direct descendant in Yuji. And therefore, it's not crazy to assume, since obviously cursed technique and cursed energy is hereditary, which is why people like the Kamo clan are able to pass down the blood manipulation ability, people like the Gojo clan are able to pass down the Six Eyes and the Limitless, and so on and so forth. Then we forgot to think about for 1 second that since Kenjaku was Yuji's mother didn't only just have anti-gravity, she also had blood manipulation and every other cursed technique she's ever stolen as a different person. And what's wild is that may not be all that Yuji got from Kenjaku. But before we move on to the other possible cursed techniques that Yuji could have inherited from Kenjaku, I'd like to once again corroborate the point that he almost definitely has blood manipulation of some sort. Because, well, for the last couple of weeks we've been hypothesizing that somehow Yuji was able to consume a part of Dagon and get Dagon's abilities because of his new red and goldish arms. I've always had a slight problem with that theory, and that's the fact that after Dagon is defeated by Toji, Dagon just turns into dust, and therefore the idea of Yuji getting any part of Dagon to consume seemed kind of like a stretch, especially when you consider the fact that Yuji wasn't around for Dagon's death, and Yuji and Dagon almost never crossed paths. But one more thing that we've been ignoring is the fact that there is an absolute guaranteed way to make your fists red, and that is flowing red scale stack, also known as the blood manipulation ability that Choso did in his bathroom fight against Yuji. Because once Choso realized that he couldn't use his blood manipulation ability outside of his body, he decided to use his blood manipulation ability inside of his body, which not only allowed him to grow armor on his ribs that stopped Yuji's punch, but also make his punches and chops so powerful that he was able to basically cut off Yuji's arm and then kill him in one punch. Just because by hardening the blood in these parts of the body, Choso was able to make them insanely durable and tough, which allowed him to amp his defense in the case of his ribcage and his offense in the case of his hands. And therefore, the reason that Yuji's running around with blood red fists nowadays is because he's finally tapping into his Kamo lineage, something that Noritoshi Kamo and Choso taught him how to do. And this is further corroborated in chapter 244, because later on in chapter 244, when Yuji and Sukuna finally come to blows, when Sukuna blocks one of Yuji's punches with 3 of his hands, we see that Sukuna is visibly shaken. Now obviously this, like every other moment in JJK, is shrouded in mystery as Sukuna just goes, "That just now?" question mark. But it's clear to see that Yuji, through the power of his blood red fist, has unlocked a new ability that's able to shake Sukuna. And considering the fact that Yuji's entire kit has always been left, right, good night, and because he lost in a fistfight against Choso in his first ever fistfight because Choso found out a way to manipulate the blood in his body, obviously Yuji, who is now aligned with Choso, would want to try and find a way to increase the power of his punches, kicks, and defense. And considering the fact that Choso and Yuji have an almost equal tie-in to the Kamo lineage, there's really no reason that Yuji shouldn't be able to do that. But it might go further than this. See, obviously there's a possibility that when Yuji strikes Sukuna and he blocks it with 3 of his hands, that the punch is so powerful that it physically shakes Sukuna because of the increased strength of the punch because of blood manipulation. However, if Yuji is able to inherit blood manipulation from Noritoshi Kamo, who wasn't even technically his parent, it would make sense to assume that Yuji would also be able to inherit Kaori's anti-gravity technique. Now, we technically don't know as to whether or not Yuji has the ability to use technique reversal, but considering how inexperienced of a sorcerer he is, it's probably safe to assume that he doesn't know how to use technique reversal. But there is also the possibility that because Sukuna spent so much time in his body, and Sukuna is a master of reverse curse technique, that Yuji's body, reflexively, like Hakari's body after a jackpot, figured out how to use reverse curse technique. And therefore, if he has the anti-gravity technique, there's also the possibility that just like Kenjaku, he's able to reverse it to make it a gravity technique. And that could possibly explain why Sukuna was shook, as after initiating contact, there's a possibility that Yuji has the ability to increase the gravity on the person that he's striking. But even if Yuji doesn't have technique reversal, there's also the possibility that every time he strikes somebody, he makes them lighter. Now, this could either be a really bad idea or a really good idea, because if the technique simply works by actually giving you an anti-gravity ability and not decreasing your weight, that would actually just make the person you were striking all the more powerful, as if they had the same amount of mass but were less affected by gravity, they would just get faster, and therefore their punches would be more powerful. However, if every single time that Yuji strikes somebody, he decreases their weight and mass, their strikes would technically get weaker. However, if this was anti-gravity or gravity, this would play into Yuji's left-right good night strategy perfectly, because if Yuji, every time he strikes you, is making gravity pull you down harder, but you get slower, which allows for more openings in his hand-to-hand combat. However, if he's making you lighter, your punches get weaker, which means as you try to dull damage to him, he's not being hurt, but he's still hurting you. The gravity bit has way less evidence than the blood manipulation bit, as I genuinely believe without a shadow of a doubt that Yuji has blood manipulation. And if I'm wrong about this, I probably won't do anything, but I'll say that I was wrong, and I'll be very confused because this seems fairly obvious. Now, after this incredibly nonchalant, wildly important moment, Higuruma says that after Kashimo, he will go out because his curse technique allows him to confiscate Sukuna's curse technique. But he also reveals to the rest of the coalition that if he's able to get the death penalty, he will not only be able to confiscate Sukuna's curse technique, but also receive the Executioner's Blade, which is a sword that has a one-hit kill rule, meaning that if Higuruma is able to land a strike against Sukuna, who now has no curse technique, that Sukuna will die right then and there on the spot. But there's some problems with this, mostly because of how Higuruma's domain expansion works. See, Higuruma technically isn't in control of his domain expansion. See, Higuruma's domain expansion is something known as deadly sentencing, and deadly sentencing operates differently from almost every other domain in existence, though domains like deadly sentencing were much more common back in the golden age of jujitsu. Basically, the way that deadly sentencing works is that Higuruma and whoever he brought into his domain expansion are put into court, and in this court, Higuruma is the prosecutor and whoever he brought in is the defendant. It's at this point that the manifestation of his curse technique, Judge Man, appears, and Judge Man announces a crime that the defendant is accused of. It's then up to the defendant to defend themselves from this crime and up to the prosecutor to prosecute. But here's the thing. Judge Man already knows whether or not the defendant is guilty, but that doesn't mean that Judge Man will immediately rule guilty. In fact, Judge Man is kind of an impartial judge in all of this, and therefore if the defendant is able to prove their innocence or the prosecutor is able to prove their guilt, the domain is either dispelled or Judge Man hands down a sentence. However, the prosecutor, Higuruma in this case, does have a technical advantage, and that is that Judge Man already knows everything about the possible crime, and therefore Judge Man is able to provide Higuruma, the prosecutor, with one piece of evidence that Higuruma can use against the defendant. The problem with using this technique against Sukuna, though, is that he's committed millions of crimes, and Judge Man chooses a crime at random, and therefore there's an equal possibility that Judge Man chooses to prosecute Sukuna over the stealing of chicken and a drink in his battle against Maharaga, as there is a chance that Judge Man chooses to prosecute Sukuna over the murder of dozens, if not hundreds, in Shibuya. And the problem with that is if Judge Man decides to prosecute Sukuna over the stealing of chicken and a drink, there's no way that Higuruma, even if he's victorious in the case, will be able to get Judge Man to sentence Sukuna with the death penalty. And therefore, Higuruma and the rest of the coalition begin to rattle off what Sukuna's crimes have been since he reincarnated in Yuji, and since he took over Megami's body. And there's a lot of crimes. However, there's one small problem. Since Judge Man looks at everything that you've ever done illegally and chooses one of those things to prosecute you on, there's a possibility in the case of things like Sukuna killing Geto's two daughters, that instead of being prosecuted for cutting their heads off, he's prosecuted for destroying their phone. And all of this is corroborated by the fact that when Yuji was put on trial by Judge Man, is that initially in his first trial, instead of being prosecuted for the dozens, if not hundreds of murders he had committed while under the control of Sukuna, Yuji is accused of illegally entering a pachinko casino under the age of 18. On top of this, there's also the fact that Sukuna was alive 1,000 years ago, and therefore there's a possibility that Judge Man will choose one of his crimes from 1,000 years ago, specifically during the Heian era. And for those of you who don't know, the Heian era in Japan was around 768 to 1158, so about 400 or so years. However, Higuruma reveals to us that in the Meiji era, which is from 1860 1962 to 1912, it's when Demon Slayer takes place, that Japan's modern-day laws were introduced. This is because the Meiji era in Japan was when Japan massively modernized. That is to say that it's when Japan broke out of the Edo period and let Western cultures in. And thus it's known as the Meiji Restoration era, when Japan kind of forsake its traditional values and focused on its industrial growth. And within the confines of the modern-day law created in the Meiji period, things such as the statute of limitations exist. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with what the statute of limitations are, the statute of limitations state that if a certain amount of time passes since you've committed a crime, you can no longer be prosecuted for said crime. And while there is usually no statute of limitations on murder, that is to say, if you commit a murder at 18 years old, you can be prosecuted for it at 75, there are statute of limitations on many more minor crimes. Like in California, the statute of limitations on things like sexual harassment is 3 years. However, just because there's no statute of limitations on murder in America does not mean Japan was always that way. In fact, in the modern law introduced in the Meiji area, there was initially a statute of limitations on murder, meaning that if you just got away with a murder for 20 or so years, you could never be prosecuted for it. Japan is also way more lax on their murder laws than we are, because for killing one person in Japan, you usually only get 10 to 15 years in prison. And thus, in actuality, getting the death sentence in Japan is pretty difficult, as you have to kill 3 or more people usually. However, the Meiji area modern laws have been altered, as in 2010, the statute of limitations on murder was actually removed, meaning that if you've committed a murder after 1985, you can be prosecuted for it. However, if you murdered somebody in 1984, you're all good. But there is one slight problem. Sukuna wasn't alive in 1985. He was alive in like 1000, and therefore one can make the argument that all of Sukuna's crimes from the Heian period shouldn't be able to be brought up by judgment because the statute of limitations has already made them irrelevant. However, the legal system from the Heian era, known as the Yoro Code, had no statutes of limitation, so there is a possibility that judgment would be able to use these crimes against Sukuna. However, there's also the law in Japan that the statute of limitations halts as soon as you leave the country. So let's say hypothetically I jaywalk, and I'm gonna go to jail for jaywalking because I jaywalked so hard. Let's assume that the statute of limitations for jaywalking is 10 years. If I flee Japan because the jaywalking police are after me and come back 11 years because I believe the statute of limitations has been raised, it actually hasn't been. In fact, I would have to spend another decade in Japan before that jaywalking crime was washed off my record. And therefore, since there's a possibility that Sukuna being split into 20 fingers could be considered him going overseas, as his actual body wasn't technically located in Japan until he reincarnated into Yuji, that he wouldn't have waited any of the statute of limitations out yet, especially considering the fact that the Yoro Code from the Heian era had no statute of limitations. But Higuruma goes on to say that Sukuna probably couldn't be prosecuted using modern law. And since Judge Man is a Shikigami manifested from Higuruma's curse technique, if Higuruma believes that it's impossible to prosecute Sukuna with modern law, at least for his Heian era crimes, Judge Man would probably think the same, and therefore Judge Man wouldn't bring up any of Sukuna's Heian era crimes. But if that's not the case, the amount of possible crimes that Judge Man could bring up is unfathomable. And the vast majority of them, even if Sukuna was found guilty, wouldn't lead to a death penalty sentencing. However, this leads everybody to speculate about one thing. That one thing is, if hypothetically confiscation is used against Sukuna, what will be confiscated? Will it be Cleave and Dismantle? Will it be his malevolent shrine? Or will it be the 10 Shadows? And thus now everybody is kind of sweating about Higuruma using deadly sentencing against Sukuna, because there appears to be so many unknowns, which is when Yuji chimes in, claiming that he knows a guaranteed way to make sure that Sukuna gets the death penalty. It's at this point that we flash back to the battle between Yuji, Higuruma, and Sukuna, where Yuji, Mei from a distance using her crows, and Higuruma proceed to put the jump and jump jutsu Kaizen against Sukuna. And as Higuruma uses his big old massive hammer to swing at Sukuna and knock up a bunch of debris, Yuji uses his now almost definitely blood manipulated fist to shoot that debris at Sukuna to close distance. At which point, upon closing distance, Yuji strikes Sukuna as he blocks with 3 hands. And it's at this point that Sukuna begins to shake. And when Sukuna is singularly focused on Itadori and they're right next to each other, Higuruma opens his domain and says it's a redo. And this redo is a retrial of Yuji's 3rd trial against Higuruma, a trial where he stood accused of a mass murder in Shibuya. Now, since technically that mass murder was Sukuna's fault and not Yuji's, even though Yuji was found guilty of it and had his curse technique stripped away from him and was given the death penalty because Higuruma saw that Yuji was genuinely resentful of him being the body that killed a bunch of people in Shibuya, he decided to dispel his domain expansion. However, Higuruma's domain expansion allows for 1 retrial of any court proceeding, and since Yuji and Higuruma hadn't undergone a retrial for the mass murder at Shibuya trial, they are now going going to use that retrial against Sukuna and make him a co-defendant alongside Yuji. However, since the onus of Judge Man's judgment comes at the hands of Higuruma, who has to present evidence in order to make Judge Man hand down a death penalty sentence against somebody that he dragged into his domain expansion with him, Higuruma at the opening of this three-way trial said to Judge Man and everybody at court that Yuji wasn't responsible for the mass murder, and that the real criminal was, and then it just cuts to Sukuna's face. Which means now, more likely than not, since Higuruma hasn't argued for Yuji to be guilty in this case, that Yuji will not receive confiscation or the death penalty. And instead, Higuruma is going to present all of the evidence of the mass murder in Shibuya against Sukuna, who more likely than not, by the means of Judge Man's judging, will receive the confiscation and death penalty. Which means it'll be up to Higuruma and Yuji to battle against Sukuna without at least one of his cursed techniques and kill him using the Executioner's blade. And thus, finally, the judge and his executioner have begun their onslaught against Sukuna. So while this chapter was filled to the brims with Japanese legalese, I believe this chapter had some of the most important twists we've ever seen in JJK's run. And it has now set up what I believe to be the final battle between Sukuna and anyone. Because if Yuji isn't responsible for the dispatching of Sukuna, I simply don't know who will be. All while possibly revealing that Yuji's cursed technique was passed down to him by Kenjaku through the means of blood manipulation. And here's the thing. Gege Gatami has always been this way. And I believe that Gege Gatami became this way because of the modern era of manga readers. See, I believe that Gege Gatami is a walking symbol of mangakas being afraid of their stories being filled with plot holes. And thus, Gege Gatami gets ahead of anybody like me pointing out a hole in their story. And the way to do that is to over-explain the ever-living hell out of everything going on. Because while the amount of people that would do this is very limited, their voices are rather loud, there would be some people who would be like, wow, what were the chances that Sukuna managed to get tried for a murder? I mean, Yuji, who's committed hundreds of murders, got tried for entering a pachinko lounge. And thus, Gege Gatami wants to make sure that everybody understands exactly why certain things are happening in the plot as to not introduce plot holes. And considering the fact that Hunter x Hunter, the only other manga in existence that over-explains things to the level that JJK over-explains things, is my favorite manga of all time, I'm obviously gonna be a bit biased towards this kind of writing style. Like, hell yeah, flesh out your universe, make it way too complicated, make people like me have to teach college level theses on Japanese law in order for the standard public to understand it. It's fun to think every once in a while. God knows I don't do it enough nowadays. But what did you guys think of this chapter? More importantly, what do you think about the possibility that Yuji has blood manipulation? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, hit that noti bell. After this, at least 3 videos off JJK, unless something cool happens again, and then, you know, I'm right back.